to welcome home Victoria Shorr.
Here's a chair.
She's a bi-coastal gal, New York and Santa Barbara, a writer as well as political activist. She started some wonderful foundations I'm sure she could talk about. She's written 4 works of fiction. The most recent before this one was The Plum Trees, which was an acclaimed historical novel. But now we celebrate her with Mid-Air. It's a wonderful 2-novella book that she's here to talk about. So I'm going to turn that over to you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Please welcome.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here in my favorite bookstore in my favorite place. This is my 4th book to be published, as Michael said. And what I still find myself hemming and hawing over when I think about it sounds like a very simple question. Is it fact or fiction? Is it nonfiction? Fiction? What's the question? It sounds simple and you'd expect a simple answer, but not from me. Because it turns out that that's really been the question for me all along. And it's taken me really years of grappling with the concept to come up with an answer and also a way of writing. Especially since I started with the assumption that I was writing nonfiction. My first 2 subjects were Joan of Arc, and then in what became my first published book, Backlands, which is a story about Brazilian bandits whose lives and deaths I had studied closely. So obviously nonfiction I was writing. There were my boxes of notes and footnotes and sources and quotations, etc., like any serious researcher. And it took 10 long years of writing, rewriting, not quite getting there, though all the facts were marshaled, but it still just wasn't turning out the way I was envisioning it. The life and the fun of it just wasn't on the page. So then I'd light candles, rewrite, walk in the Santa Monica Mountains, go to my desk early in the morning and late at night, trying to pull it together and make it as interesting to the reader as it was to me, until finally it came to me that I could put together what I'd learned and all the facts and quotes and details and take them into fiction. And then almost like some storied lightning flash, but it really wasn't a lightning flash. It felt at first more like just another rewrite. But once I gave myself that permission to fill in the blanks, make it fly or try to, my books started writing themselves. And suddenly, as Ingmar Bergman put it, I can write about anything, anywhere. I can stand on my head and write. The world expands, the world is new. In situations like these, one might dare utter the word grace. And that's sort of how it was with this book. The first novella, Great Uncle Edward, I wrote in about 2010. I'd read Caroline Blackwood's Great Granny Webster, which I really liked, and it came to me that I could do the same thing with my own story, which turned out to be really enjoyable, Bergman's Grace. Writing about people I loved, filling in the blanks with leaps of the imagination. In other words, writing fiction, but with a starting point that was grounded in real life, which is what interests me. And the same with Cleveland Auto Wrecking, though that was written more than 10 years later, during the pandemic, but also about people I knew and loved, and with the blanks filled in. Semi-fiction, I'm thinking I should call it. I thought tonight that I would read from Cleveland Auto Wrecking because a lot of it takes place in California. So I'm gonna just do a bit of a reading from there.
Okay.
It never seemed strange to the White brothers that it was called Cleveland Auto Wrecking, though it wasn't in Cleveland. But that was because they'd all heard the story, or some version, that their father, aged 13 at the time and illiterate, had gotten off the boat alone at Ellis Island with one English word in his head, Cleveland. It was around 1900. He had relatives in Cleveland, he had been told. Someone presumably from the same dark corner of the world that he himself had fled, in what was either Poland or Ukraine at the time. It was never clear. Not that a border made much difference for people like him. who were not only poor but in danger on either side of any border they knew. And he must have known by the time he was 13 that he had nothing to gain there, and had already conjured enough of a sense of self to travel the 900 miles from eastern Galicia to Hamburg, where most of the boats carrying boys like him in those days left. His passage to the New World would have been the cheapest, the steerage of the steerage. The highest bunk, they were stacked 6 up, or the one in the middle, whichever was least desirable, in the hottest or coldest part of the hold, whichever was worse. But he was 13, so maybe less affected by hardship, maybe not even aware. Maybe he felt like a boy camping out, was a boy camping out, taking everything as it came, simply the way it was. Even the Statue of Liberty. Maybe she'd been simply part of the trip, neither more nor less. Lady Liberty, lamp aloft, good, fine, but nothing to fall on one's knees for, or sing hallelujah with the rest of his shipmates. He wouldn't even have known the words. But there she was, just as there he was. He had made it, in his case, with a tag on his clothes that matched him up to a name on the passenger list that the customs man in Ellis Island couldn't pronounce. It started with a W, though, and was short. So, White, wrote the man on the paper he gave the boy. A new name for a new life, he is said to have told the boy. But whether customs would have bothered or the boy understood his English is anyone's guess. It would have been fine with him anyway, as this last link to his past was cut. He had left nothing there that he would in his long life regret, or at least mention. Did he still have a mother, or had she already died in childbirth, as so many of the lone young immigrants' mothers had? Been replaced by a stepmother who would have been glad enough to see his back? Or was it his father who had died, leaving a woman who, even if she was his birth mother, had barely looked up for a final farewell from the heavy serge piecework she was sewing, praying more that her needle didn't break than that this dispensable 3rd or 4th son might live through the voyage. God would protect or would not, but if the needle broke on the overcoat she was sewing, the rest of them would not eat that night. But in this case, God did protect, first on the trip across the bloodlands of Eastern Europe, and then on the sea, stormy or calm, he never said, and finally that day in Ellis Island. He was small for his age. You need more than groats and thin broth that he'd subsisted on to get tall. Still, they didn't stop him there. He was vaccinated for smallpox along with all the other immigrants, and the New York doctors passed him through. No leprosy, no cholera. There was a series of questions they were all asked while still on board, and since he mentioned Cleveland, he was herded into a tender that transferred all those headed west onto a ferry, which delivered them non-stop to the Erie Railroad Terminal in Jersey City. Forget New York. These folks were headed to the Promised Lands, Ohio and beyond, Indiana, Minnesota, and among them this boy with a new name that he couldn't pronounce yet, but must have liked, Sam White, an American name. Like the names he would have heard but couldn't read as they steamed away from the water. Binghamton, Elmira, Hornell, Jamestown. Maybe it was here that he fell asleep as the train crawled along the south shore of Lake Erie. He'd seen enough water lately, enough for a lifetime, it turned out. No seaside holidays, no cruises in this boy's future, not even years later when he could. Eventually the Erie Limited turned away from the lake and went south. The railroad had a big immigrant trade in those early years of the 20th century, and there would have been others in the battered coaches where Sam White found himself. Someone who would have spoken his language, but probably not English. So when they heard the conductor calling out Ohio, maybe they thought Ohio was Cleveland and woke the sleeping boy, helped him off kindly at the wrong stop. In Youngstown, not Cleveland. Not an uncommon way for fate to apportion lifetimes to these young immigrants in those days, 1902, 1903. Why he didn't take the next train on to Cleveland sometime later, no one ever thought to ask. Anyway, that card lay where it was played, as he could say in German and Russian, though not yet in English, and Sam White stayed where he had landed. Years later, though, in an uncharacteristic nod to earlier dreams, he named his wrecking yard Cleveland after that near miss, the future. Now we fast forward to 1945. By this time, Sam White owned a junkyard. He had bought a house. America was working out for him. The war ended, and all three of Sam White's sons came home and went to work in his junkyard. Their wages rolled back into the family business. A few years later, a big parcel of empty land outside of town came up for sale, 10 acres or so, and Sam White surprised the world and bought it. And once he'd bought that land, he took a look around and told his sons that the wasteland land around them was now an auto wrecking yard. No one could call these sons of his dreamers, but they too were riding the rising tide. There were a few old car wrecks among the junk from the other yard. Once they had these pulled apart, they could offer not only scrap metal, but salvaged car parts. Before long, they got someone to tack together a plywood office and someone else to paint a sign. "What are you calling it?" the painter asked. The sons turned to their father. "Cleveland Auto Wrecking," he said. It was around then that the two older boys got married, Roy to someone from Cleveland and Mel to a woman from Girard, a small, tough town nearby. They'd all been living together in the new house that Sam White had bought, and Roy and Mel stayed on, the rent-free aspect eclipsing all the good reasons against such a step. The wives hated each other, but neither wanted to leave the field to the other. Roy's wife was the first to produce a baby who didn't look like him, especially if you did the math, which, being people of the ledger, the Whites did, but being as well folk of few words, didn't mention. Figured Roy could take that as he would. As for the rest of them, they loved the child. Didn't require a blood test for that. Then Mel's wife followed suit, but anyone coming by of an evening would find the one giving that baby a bottle was Mel. It took a while to figure out the sick mother Mel's wife was always visiting was in fact a local hoodlum, until one night a bullet came whizzing through an upstairs window facing the street. It happened to be where Roy's baby was sleeping, and the next day he and his wife left for Cleveland. Her father had some kind of business going on up there, although Roy didn't say what. His mother didn't ask. As for her, it was around then that she found she'd had, quote, enough of me being married when he isn't, as she put it to her sons one evening, indicating Sam White's empty chair. She had a cousin in California and was going out for an extended visit. Sam White could come or not. And he might not have if she'd gone to the cousin in Baltimore or the one in New York. But West had always been where his luck lay, and as he loaded up the two-tone Buick that he'd bought, second-hand this time, up from Third, he lifted his head for a moment and felt young again, younger even than he had with the girlfriend. The promise of a new beginning trumped even that in his soul. He hadn't known it till he saw the road map his sons had laid out on the kitchen table, the thick red lines, the new interstates, Eisenhower's work. Sam White had voted for Adlai Stevenson, but still liked Ike, especially when he leaned over that map. "You want me?" he asked his wife. Not that it mattered. He was going. "Do I have a choice?" she asked the room in general, but with her twinkle. B was delegated to drive them out, since he was the one who wasn't married. Maybe he'd find someone out there for himself and stay, his mother told Roy. At least that's what she was hoping. But he didn't. He came back to Cleveland Auto Wrecking and moved back into the house with the bullet hole in the front bedroom window. Mel's wife had left by then, but her tough guy boyfriend was making some noise about getting more support money from Mel. Youngstown was a mafia town, and B put in a call to Vince De Niro and went downtown to eat some veal scallopini at Cicero's restaurant. The White brothers were small fry who just wanted to be left alone with their wrecking yard, B explained. They may even come in handy in the future. You never know when you can use a wrecking yard, B had pointed out. Which De Niro must have figured was true. There wouldn't be any more bullets through the White brothers' windows, he assured B, over the deal. He called for some Zabalione, pulled out a cigar, quote, what JFK smokes, right off the plane from Cuba, and made the check go away. B pocketed the cigar and told De Niro to come by if he ever needed any parts for his car. Cadillacs don't need parts, Vince smiled to B. True, B smiled back, showing the gap between his front teeth for the first time that night. A real smile. But when they do, we've got him. Don't forget. And maybe Vince did, or maybe he didn't, but it turned out not to matter either way. There had recently been one of those gangland power plays going on around town. And a few weeks later, around midnight, as Vince De Niro stepped out of Cicero's and slipped into his Cadillac, lit one of his Cubans, and turned on the ignition, it was his turn. He too was blown to high heaven in an explosion so intense it shattered windows and shook houses, quote, for 20 blocks around, according to the paper. The police combed what was left of the car for evidence, but all they found was the same nothing they'd found in other car bombings. No evidence, no witnesses to call. But the ones they did call were the White brothers to come and tow the wreck away. So the Cadillac ended up in Cleveland Auto Wrecking after all. B and his brothers shook their heads. They liked Vince. Then B remembered the cigar, which he'd found when he went home that night, still in the pocket of the suit he'd worn to Cicero's. An Upman, what JFK smokes, he told his brothers. Leave it to Vince, they all agreed. B went out on the porch and lit it. The best cigar he'd ever smoked.
Wow. Wonderful storytelling. I'm curious, you wrote one story, Great Uncle Edward, prior 2010, but
Yeah.
then you wrote this one during the pandemic. Two different times. You wrote these two in two different times, and why did you decide to put them together?
Well, they seem to kind of mesh in a way, you know. The reason I call the book Midair is because I had this idea that they, you know, as one family was declining, the other one was rising, and there was a point where they crossed in midair, and so it just seemed to work, you know. And you know, all of my work, I've had these books published in the last 10, not even 10 years. I don't know, 8 years, 5 years, 6 years. But they've been written. I've been writing for many, many years. It just took a long time to get them published. So a lot of things were written at different times. You know.
Norton seems to like your work then. They
did
published your last two books.
all four.
All four of them.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that was really lucky because up until they said yes, I had gotten nothing but no from much smaller houses, you know. And it just took a big publishing house, you know.
yeah.
I mean, I used to dream about being published by Norton, but I would have been happy to be published by anyone, you know.
So you end up getting your first choice.
I ended up getting my first choice by amazing twist of fate, really.
What you read with Cleveland Auto Wrecking is, you wrote it during the pandemic, and I was just wondering how you got the idea for this story and how it all came together.
It's fun because one of the characters in Cleveland Auto Wrecking, we knew some funny stories about him, and I told a friend of mine in LA who has a lot of dinner parties, you know. Some of these stories, and every time she had a dinner party, she'd say to me, "Tell them these stories. Tell them these stories." So I thought, well, if she's interested, maybe other people would be interested too. And we were staying in a house out in Shelter Island, and I had COVID right in the beginning, March of 2020. I'd been really sick, and I just kind of got out of bed and sat down and started outlining this and thinking this would really be fun, you know, to write, I think.
So you really enjoyed writing this?
Well, I did. I did enjoy writing it. Yeah,
Was there a real Cleveland Auto Wrecking in Youngstown?
there was.
Yeah?
That's why I call it semi-fiction. I don't know what to call my work, because like all these people were real in the book, every single one of them.
Really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Have they seen the book?
Well, luckily, I mean, I don't know if it's luckily or not, because it's very much my version.
Yeah.
But the people in Great Uncle Edward have all walked on to the spirit world,
Okay.
so they're not with us. And the people in Cleveland Auto Wrecking have too, for the most part.
Especially Vince De Niro.
especially Vince. One of the characters is still alive, and a lawyer for Norton called me and said, "Do you think she'll sue you?" I said, "I don't think so."
Did this actually happen to Vince then?
Oh, this
Wow.
is true.
Wow.
In fact, this is so funny because when I submitted this manuscript to Norton, my editor there, about the Vince De Niro part. There's more in the actual book. There's a more about the leading up to it and the whole gangland, situation there. And he said, you can't use you made up the most ridiculous names. You can't possibly use these names. And I sent him the clippings from the newspaper with these names. These were the real names of the people, and there were this rash of car bombs going on.
Oh.
That was what they did. Maybe 3 people in the 60s. With JFK still,
Yeah.
our president. And it was terrible. It was crazy.
When you said there were no witnesses, does that mean like everybody knew but nobody talked?
It was funny because the one right before this, just before that happened, he had engineered, all the police knew that he was behind exactly the same car blow up of another mafioso in Youngstown called Sandy Naples. And it was either Sandy or his brother whose car Vince had blown up. And the police brought him in and he wouldn't talk at all and didn't give any names, of course, And then the exact same thing happened, and the police had said in the newspaper they wish they could just call him back and ask him if he feels like talking about it now.
Interesting. I have one more question and then I'll turn it over to the audience. What I really like about your writing is you put us there, right into the spot, and getting your inspiration. Do you spend a lot of time in these places for research for your writing, or did you grow up?
Yeah, these 2 stories I knew from personal experience. The plum trees, it was all research.
Okay.
It was all research, because I didn't go over to Auschwitz or anywhere.
Okay.
I just relied on listening to what people said. And then there's this amazing movie called Shoah that Claude Lanzmann, the Frenchman, made. It's like 11 parts, and I just sat there and watched it, and it's filmed there. And I felt like, well, thank you, you just saved me, going over to Poland.
Wow.
And then, so the first thing I wrote actually was the Joan of Arc piece that's in Midnight, my second book. And that I wrote pretty much before I went over. I did go over a little bit, but I didn't do the research there. I just figured if Edgar Allan Poe could write those stories about Paris and never having been there, I could do the same.
Interesting.
I really appreciated your description of steerage, being another descendant of a steerage person, that I've never heard it described quite.
Of which person? I'm sorry?
Steerage. The steerage.
The boat going
in the
over.
boat.
Oh,
Yeah.
I know. It
Yeah.
really,
Yeah, the detail there was.
Yeah, it was
Very
really,
much.
that's research,
Yeah,
not
sure.
personal story. I didn't hear his story really. It's funny because with these older people, you never think to ask them these questions. Then they're gone and there's nobody to ask. So
Yeah.
you rely on people who have left personal histories. It's so great. Yeah.
It's not only that Norton likes your books, but the New York Times